Welcome to Tales of Britain and Ireland. This is a podcast telling the stories, legends and folktales of Britain and Ireland in no particular order. Presented by Graham and coming direct from South Yorkshire, each episode tells a story or selection of stories from all across these islands and throughout their history, followed by a short and decidedly inexpert discussion of the origin and themes of each tale.
Hello everybody and welcome back, and a prolonged wait it has been even for me. Words I now say at the start of every episode. And because of that, I'm not going to mess around, I will be plunging straight in, but I will just say before I do that this episode was originally written as a live show that I've tweaked a bit. Now I'm not sure whether that will make a difference, but if you detect a change in tone, that might be it. Hopefully it's good, or at least neutral, but one thing that certainly is the case is that, as is my general way in tales that I tell live, I have strayed more from the originals than I tend to in my podcast episodes. Now I know even in the podcast I usually add a great deal of tacky verbal ornamentation and off-topic rambles, but in this case I have more deeply embellished. The originals harder perhaps to make out from my take on them, for I have added rather liberally to the narratives, including what must be my most egregious extrapolation to date, where I have crafted a whole story out of essentially a single sentence. I hope on this you can forgive me, I hope it's worth it, and do note that in the discussion section I include a lot more detail about the tales that I took inspiration from, and some other related tales I didn't include as well. Once again, I hope all this works for you. Please let me know either way for engagement and algorithms and such what. Or, spare my feelings and don't. Your choice. Before we begin, I'd like to give a massive thanks to Meishi for reaching out to me and offering me music for the podcast, which I've taken up with glee, some of which can be found on this episode. A link to their work can be found on my website. The only other thing to say after such a huge break is thank you to everyone who is listening despite that. In this age where punctuality and reliability seem to be the key cornerstone of success in creative arts, as well as being, good, I suppose, I really, really appreciate that you've come back despite my lack of achievement in at least two of those key areas. Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be back with this selection of tales, pun very much intended there, tales from the Peak District. Now that's me keeping it mysterious as to the subject of those tales, as if it isn't right there in the episode title. Let's begin. And let's begin with an epilogue. The man from Hayfield was all alone now, had been alone for a very long time. It had been his choice to remain so. There was always time later, when he could join them. There was always time later. But for now the Hayfield man continued to walk alone through the wastelands. Vegetation was long gone, most of the topsoil with it. Those strange lichens and extremophile bacterial blooms provided paint splashes of colour on the heat-blasted rocks. Life finds a way. Incredibly, some human-wrought structures survived still, though crumbling certainly, erected by those countless Ozymandia whose names remained only in his memory. They who had built and destroyed and rebuilt cities and empires and even civilization itself time and time again. The place to which he was headed wasn't the place it had happened, of course. It couldn't be, for geological processes had long since taken that place, its hills, moors and crags, and slowly folded them back into the core. But by some measure or other, it could be said to be roughly about the same point on the globe. And for this gesture, that was enough. He arrived as the sun might once have said to be rising, though the huge red fire took up nearly half the sky now, and the light of it never really disappeared. There stood the Hayfield man, looking around at the desolation, and allowing himself to remember. You might imagine he'd think of it often, but in actuality it had been eons since he'd allowed himself to. But now he did let a wave of nostalgia crash over him as his memory transformed the barren scene in front of him into a sparkling pool of fresh water, illuminated by the first light of a, by comparison, much shrunken sun, just peeking over the horizon. He recalled how he had produced a pocket watch from his waistcoat and consulted it, though he already knew he was on time. It was Easter Sunday. Soon there would be distant bells summoning him away to church. But they could wait, for he had something far more important to do. His whole body was shaking with a nervous anticipation, and the Hayfield man smiled at the intensity of that memory. He had been so young once to feel such things, and he had reached down then towards the still waters, and from them a hand emerged, grasped his, pulled, and there had been an almighty splash. Epilogue over. The Peak District, or simply the Peaks, for those of you unaware, is the name for a sizable area of land that sits in what I, a northerner through and through, will always sort of persist in thinking of as the middle of England, despite any reasonable attempts to persuade me otherwise by showing me a map or whatever. Defining exactly where and where is not the Peaks is subject to some debate. It has an odd identity in relation to counties, for it is split between South and West Yorkshire, Derbyshire, Staffordshire, Old Lancashire and even Cheshire, a tranquil nexus point binding them all together, today a tourist destination for many of the large cities that surround it. Day trippers from Sheffield, Manchester, Derby, Stoke and Nottingham all together, their county rivalries put aside as all agree on the desirability of a Bakewell tart and a traffic jam on a bank holiday weekend. It is an entirely inland rural area, renowned for its beautiful landscape of high hilltops, windswept plateaus, valleys and gorges, dramatic gritstone escarpments, known as edges. The only watch-out with its name, I think, is that while this is a very upland area, the peaks themselves are less, peaky than the name suggests. Certainly not the towering mountain peaks that can be found in other UK national parks. But neither are they simply gentle, green, rolling hills. Though some of that latter ilk may be found here, the peaks, by and large, are smaller, less dramatic than a proper mountain, but definitely high up, because they start pretty high up to begin with, and with a kind of crozzled, weather-beaten look to them. Old, scarred hills that have seen a thing or two in their time. Now predominantly that tourist destination, in the not-too-distant past it was a place of a few scattered villages, extensive sheep farms, with quarries and mines cutting fresh wounds into the landscape. One would expect to find here stories of giants and dragons, ghosts of highwaymen, and quite possibly the devil himself, for he does like to get a bit involved with big piles of rocks and other geological features. And yet, some of the most famous supernatural denizens of the peaks are rather more incongruous. And they are, of course, as you already know by the episode title, I've spoiled myself here, the Peak District Mermaids. For the Peak District has surely the greatest concentration of inland mermaids anywhere in Britain and Ireland. You'll see on the internet one or two often mentioned, but there's not just one or two I'm going to talk about today, but 3 separate mermaids, and there's suggestions of at least 2 more on top of that I might touch on in the discussion section. Despite it not appearing to be their natural habitat at all, the place is practically swimming in things. Now I find the implications of this a little alarming. If there can be mermaids even in the landlocked peaks, well, where else can the blighters get to? The local swimming pool, the office water cooler, an overpriced festival bottle of Evian, could that hold a tiny little mermaid? Perhaps. But today I'm going to limit myself to talking about the mermaids of the peaks, and quite how they got here. Now when it was open, There was a poem on the wall of the Mermaid Inn on Blakemere Road. An extract of it read like this. And there before your eyes is the silent mermaid pool. The moorland wind that passes over the moorland track tosses the cotton grasses and moves the waters black. You will not hear her stir, maid far from her kindred sea, but still there is a mermaid, or so they said to me. Fair as our ocean's daughters bent on her looking glass. At midnight from the waters, if you should chance to pass, she calls on you to greet her, combing her dripping crown. And if you go to meet her, she ups and drags you down. A warning to all who drank in this public house of the dangers of that eponymous aquatic creature. Best stick to beer and not have a glass of water, eh? Could be mermaid infested. But neither the Mermaid pub nor the verse was there when the protagonist of our first tale, let's call him Gordon, for reasons that will quickly become apparent, when he was growing up in a village in the southwest of the Peaks, the Staffordshire side, relatively close to where the Mermaid Inn would, in time, stand. At that time it was possible, incredible as it seems now, for a young man to grow up in the Peaks without knowing just how deadly a mermaid could be. Chronicles do not recall where exactly he grew up, perhaps Gradbach, Upper Hume. But I think I will locate our Gordon in Flash. Flash, the highest village in the UK, apparently, which surprised me given the heights of Scotland and Wales. I am genuinely shocked. There's no dramatic mountains here, as I've said. The village is just sort of high by dint of being very far above sea level. And if you doubt Flash's claim to that, as I know I did, well, know that there was a whole thing with a Scottish village and the Ordnance Survey had to get involved, and Flash won. Flash also has a teapot parade, but not back when Gordon was growing up. So Flash was about as far from the sea, both horizontally and vertically, as it was possible to really grow up in England. Yet, despite this, or perhaps because of it, the young Gordon found himself drawn inexorably to the ocean, and as soon as he was able, still but a young lad, he took off, quick as a flash, headed for the coast, and there secured for himself a posting on a ship. We won't inquire too much about the nature of the ship. Best not to when it comes to English history, to be honest. There are worse things than mythological beings that drown and devour flesh. So it was a ship, and though he was successful in getting himself the posting, I'm sorry to report that, perhaps not too surprisingly, a childhood high in the Peaks had not prepared him well for his first proper job on the ocean waves, where there was nary a discarded millstone in sight. So compared to the other young men, most of them brought up on the coast, salt water running in their veins, well, he found his ability somewhat lacking, and his position remained a lowly one, and the respect he was held in by his fellows rather followed suit. We join him, alone as he usually is, in a very rare period of respite, neither toiling nor suffering the taunts of his companions. A calm sea beautifully illuminated by a full moon, the kind of warm night that did not come often enough. And our Staffordshire lad was sitting on deck alone with his thoughts and the stars, gazing out into the silvery waters, considering who knows what. How many wells would it take to fit all this water in? And how would they all look when they were dressed? You know, proper Peak District thoughts. When ripples caught his eye, a shape broke the surface of the water, a splash of silver and pink. He stood, intrigued, moved to the edge of the vessel for a better look. And, well, I've spoilt the surprise for you guys, sorry about that. You know exactly what he has seen. But he, when he understood it, was very surprised indeed. He rubbed his eyes a few times, shook his head. Had the rum, the sodomy, or the lash clouded his vision? But no, there she was in the pale moonlight, a beautiful, delicate creature, a woman in the waves, all long golden hair, the occasional sight of a dazzling tail, and of course, that signature, shapely bosom. Now I find myself often pondering upon the topic of mermaids' breasts. From a purely scientific angle, you understand, nothing sordid about this. For there is something peculiar about the breasts of a mermaid, isn't there? Because, well, mermaids, famously, they have the top bit of a mammal, but the bottom bit of a fish. And that's where the reproductive bits go. And fish, lots and lots and lots of eggs. That's the survival evolutionary strategy there. And breasts, well, they produce milk when you've got 1 or 2 young, right? Okay, so how do those things fit together? And you might say, well, perhaps mermaids are mammals, or at least have mammalian reproductive bits. And I'm willing to concede that's certainly a possibility, but you don't really see very many whale-tailed mermaids, do you? They're all scaly. There's very definitely something fishy going on down there. So a curiosity, but that has got me thinking, well, perhaps what we're looking at in a mermaid's bosom is not, in fact, breasts that contain milk at all, not functional breasts as we understand them. No. For what is it that mermaids eat? Sailors. What attracts sailors? Breasts. May we be looking at some form of evolutionary adaptation designed to lure the sailors in, like the light of an anglerfish? The same kind of magic of evolution that produces the fake eye patterns on the wings of a moth or the ears of a tiger. These are facsimiles of breasts. They assist the mermaid in attracting prey. The more prominent, the larger, the better. A trait bred into mermaids generation after generation, since men first took to the waters on rickety wooden rafts. And then I started to think, well, if that's the case, and we shouldn't understand mermaid bosoms to be at all to do with the sexual function, well, then wouldn't that mean male mermaids have breasts too? And that might explain why we see very few male mermaids. We do, in fact, see them. They've all just got breasts. And you know what? I really like that conclusion. But yes, I'm absolutely making suppositions here. And to go back to Gordon, he wasn't thinking about any of this at all. He was simply entranced by her. Soon the sweet lilt of her seductive song drifted over the boat, and his ears was ensorcelled as his eyes, and he was soon tearing his shirt off, launching himself from the side of the ship into the cold waters for a chance to get but a fraction closer to her, the most beautiful creature he'd ever seen in his life, the fishtail apparently not bothering him at all. And by rights, that should have been it. The end of the story. The other sailors watching him go, half-heartedly trying to stop him. No, don't do it. Oh, no, he went. Never mind. They knew how this would play out, you see, and they'd have to report to the captain. Lad from the mountains went and got himself lured to his doom by a mermaid, hasn't he? And the captain rolls his eyes. I told them at head office, you know, I don't want no scurvy landlubbers on my ship, always getting seduced by the first mermaid that they see. There'll be paperwork, and we'll be on demand. Would they listen? Those handle polishers at the Admiralty. And everyone would sympathise with the captain, shake their heads and roll their eyes in agreement, and there'd be a good amount of class camaraderie against the ignorance of management, of the kind that's conducive to creating a strong sense of workplace solidarity that ironically assists management out. But to everyone's surprise, a couple of hours later, Gordon was back on deck, dripping wet, no parts of him obviously devoured, or at least if they had been, it had been temporary, and with a huge grin on his face. For days that turned into weeks, the mermaid followed the boat, and whenever Gordon had some free time, he was splash, and the two were soon wrapped in a watery embrace. They were forming a genuine connection that didn't seem based on her desire to eat or drown him. No, she was as drawn to his mysterious siren call, this man of the mountains, as he was to hers, and soon the two were helplessly head over heels and tail fins respectively in love. It was sweet and it was true. and there are various logistical questions I have about certain elements of it, which I will not sully this story by speculating on, any more than I've already sullied it with that whole breast tangent, Now this appeared to be a perfect holiday romance, you might think. That would, of course, naturally end like all holiday romances do. Or so I've heard. I've never experienced a holiday romance myself, somehow never been snapped up by hot singles when visiting a National Trust bookshop, can't understand it. But, as I understand, the nature of holiday romances is that they are short, temporary, they end. The people involved have to go back to their real lives. There are barriers of distance between them. And the obstacles in the place of this particular couple were greater than most. But, like life, love can surprise one by finding a way. They made a pact. They would be together, despite the logistical forces arrayed against them. And they hatched a plan to make it so. And you might be thinking you know what this plan is. Or at least if I hadn't introduced the episode as I have done, you might be thinking you knew what the plan was. And that would be something like, surely he's going to get a little place on the coast, right? She can live in the ocean, he on the land, and they can meet on the shore every day. A sensible long-term solution, that one, right? Well, instead, they could, of course, go live in the Peak District. Very inland, very up a lot of hills. No sea for her to live in anywhere nearby. It must have been that Whitby was out of the budget, Scarborough was too touristy, maybe he had a fear of donkeys, I don't know. Maybe it was that she wanted to see the mountains. I can get behind that. Pretty exciting if you've only ever lived in the sea. Maybe she insisted to him, poured her heart out in beautiful mermaid song of how she wanted to be, where the people are, which was apparently the Peak District. Maybe he was the one to oversell her on the place that he had planned for her future home. A pool, he said. A bottomless pool. Bottomless, she said. Like me. Oh, you're right, he said. Bottomless just like you. It couldn't be more fitting. Basically destiny, isn't it? They were definitely still in the limerent stage of love where everything and anything seems possible. They could conquer all. And when the ship finally pulled back into port and his time served was up, their journey began. I would give anything for the details of how the move worked, practically speaking, My go-to reference for this, which really shows my age, is sort of like Free Willy, but in reverse. Though without access to a big truck, it was a much more impressive feat. It throws up more questions about mermaid biology. How much water do mermaids need anyway? Could they basically sort of carry her up there and just give her a wet towel down now and again? Or did they have to rig up some kind of salt bath contraption on the back of a cart and keep her almost permanently submerged? And then take that up to one of the highest, most inland points in England on bumpy roads that were made for pack animals. Which sounds fraught with danger if that was the case. Also, having now mentioned the salt water, what's the deal with that exactly? Did they just assume mermaids were euryhaline, or did they do some tests before, dunking her into a whole lot of fresh water and just hoping that she didn't explode? Once again, very helpfully, I don't know. Anyway, however they did it, even the easiest option is, I feel, very hard. An incredibly impressive feat, all power to the two of them. Because, as you've probably worked out, they did it, achieved it. Young love, how heartwarming, brings a tear to your eye. Yeah! I wonder at what point it started to sour. Was it the point perhaps where she saw the destination he had in mind for her? Doxy Pool, high up on the rocky ridge called the Roaches, remote even for that remote area, not even particularly close to any village. And perhaps he kept her so far away because he knew what the locals' attitude was to people even from the Derbyshire side of the border, never mind a whole foreign woman with a tail instead of legs, who they might mistake for a southerner. And what would happen to one of them up here doesn't really bear thinking about. Or maybe there were darker reasons. He kept her away because he wanted to have her only to himself. Difficult to tease out his intentions, but the result would be the same. A gloomy tarn for her, all black waters and bleakness. And while the view on occasions is stunning, and I'm sure she appreciated that, this was a small place compared to even most lakes, and certainly next to the incredible vast ocean she had previously called her home. Now perhaps I'm too cynical. Maybe the change came later. There was a honeymoon period when the novelty and the being with him made up for the starkness of her surroundings. Maybe it was after a particularly intense bout of love-making. They were relaxing. She was smoking a cigarette out of the water, and she asked him, "So what exactly am I going to do all day when we're not engaged in this incredibly edifying, scant on the details love-making?" And in response, Gordon, who hadn't really thought about that, blurted out a quick answer. "Hiking, that's a big thing people do around here." And she looked at him, flicked the tip of her tail out of the water for emphasis. "Oh, yeah," he said, "climbing's really big." She rolled her eyes. He flailed desperately. "You know, wild swimming is so hip and in these days, and you can definitely do that." "Great," she said. "That'll make a real change, yeah, thanks." Or perhaps I'm still being too cynical. Maybe their relationship was truly fantastic, and all of this mattered not a jot as long as the two of them were together, and it lasted right up until the day when suddenly they weren't, because Gordon up and died. She did not do it. No nefarious circumstances were involved, need be involved. No, he just died of something or other, and this was the dim and distant past when, with very little medical care and living in a very remote area, there was quite a lot to just up and kill you. You know, he might have slipped on a wet rock on a treacherous hillside after, say, visiting a pool, caught a severe cold from swimming in a freezing cold pool, drowned in a murky, bottomless pool in which he was swimming, that sort of thing. And then he was dead, and she remained there alone. I don't even know if she found out that he died, or if she thought he just up and left her. But regardless, here she was, in a small pool in the middle of the peaks, all alone, a single mermaid. Claustrophobia setting in. When I was a child, I went to a small local zoo. I won't name it here. And I remember there was a tiger in a cage. The cage was not very big. Placed, it seemed, directly onto a patch of grass that was mostly worn to mud. And whatever else was in this cage with the tiger was minimal. Some water, somewhere for food to go, a stick. And I remember watching that tiger pace. Deeply upsetting to me as a child. I remember very little from that time, but I can still picture it now, walking back and forth, and when I caught its eye, it looked at me, and I didn't have the words for it, but I knew that there was something very, very wrong in the gaze of that creature. And I think of that tiger when I think of the mermaid of Doxy Pool. Every day she'd swim back and forth. Sometimes, for a change, she'd swim down into the murky depths until she dared go no further, all mixed with soil and clay blacker than the ocean depth she had known. And then up she'd swim, back and forth, up and down, round and round, day after day. And mermaids live a very long time. Over the years, tales began to be told of Doxy Pool, how it seemed oddly silent, how birds would avoid drinking from the waters, even flying over it. Perhaps one too many, had been plucked out of the sky by a hungry, increasingly crazed mermaid. And by the 19th century, the rhyme was up in the pub, and the pub bore the name the Mermaid. An account from around this time says that, on stormy nights, her wailing cry is heard above the moaning of the wind. Her strange form has been seen gliding over the surface of the dark waters, and woe betide any luckless mortal who chances to pass that way after midnight. And now, if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, you'll know that I'm not a big believer of morals in stories. I don't think they generally fit. But sometimes they do just seem to stare at you in the face and demand attention. And I'd suggest that the moral of this story is, even in the name of love, perhaps especially in the name of love, do not let yourself be restricted to a tiny pool when you were meant to swim in the whole of the vast ocean. A lesson that is perhaps evergreen in its relevance. And on that ponderous note, we leave this first story behind and say goodbye to the poor mermaid of Doxy Pool. Blakemere, or Blackmere sometimes, is some 3 or so miles distant from Doxy Pool. A valley is in between them, and it's a little bit larger, though still not of a size to give it the title lake. This was a pool, a pond. It sits on the Morridge, which is a ridge, along which Blakelow Road now runs. And in its nature it's much like that of Doxy, silent and dark, the surface of the water disturbed by the near-constant winds that pass over that exposed spot, causing a rippling of waves back and forth. But all with a cracking view. And it too is said to be the home of a mermaid, an evil mermaid, a sexy seductress who drowns men who she lures there. Or so we are led to believe, for lurid newspaper reports speak of a shapely arm rising out of the water, beckoning her victims. Only men, it seems. Men for whom apparently the arm is enough. Not, I should say, because they think she is drowning. No one ever claims that. No, this is a quote-unquote shapely arm. And that is just enough to get the men in the water. What an awful creature with her wicked, womanly wiles. And so her story is, inevitably enough, all about the awfulness of men, which is probably the most ancient story of all. Joshua Linnett had a crush, not on a mermaid, like our Gordon, but rather on a local woman, whose name, of course, goes unrecorded. And while sometimes a crush, reciprocated, can be a sweet thing, a crush unreciprocated is, many times, perhaps even most of the time, the opposite. For the crushee who wants it not, it is a deeply unpleasant, malignant thing. And this was very much that sort of crush. Joshua was going through the motions with his crush. One day, passing the woman in the market, he declared how fair he found her to be. She laughed sweetly, politely, thanked him with a little curtsy, and then moved quickly on. And either he did not detect the uncomfortableness in her tone, or he ignored it. What matter was it to him? He was working through the motions. He was going to do all the right things, and then she would be his. That's how it worked. Women like flowers and compliments, so next, flowers. An unwanted hand-picked bouquet left outside of her door. So it continued, flowers and compliments. She received each one with a growing fear, each a little cut deeper than the last, until she woke, dreading opening the door to find yet another threatening token awaiting her. He badgered her for days, weeks. But he was not a patient man, and it was not long until the whole thing reached its awful and inevitable crescendo. In a very public place he got down on one knee and popped the question, to which the answer was, of course, no, as polite a no as she possibly could give, but there was no no that would have been polite enough to avoid his hurt feelings. And the pain of a man's hurt feelings is, of course, the very worst pain imaginable. He had been humiliated, and his obsession with controlling her, an obsession with control he had claimed was love, it remained just as strong. But now it was revealed for what it truly was. His thoughts turned to hatred and revenge and re-exerting that control in any way he could. Within hours, he was telling everyone who would listen that she was a witch. It was the only explanation. She had bewitched him in order to humiliate him, and for this she had to pay. Did he believe this? Hard to say, barely matters. Probably not. He just saw it as a way to hurt her. And I'm very sorry to tell you that while it should surely have been preposterous, in actuality, the ability of this rumour to hurt her was very great indeed. Because his lies were believed by enough of the village folk that soon enough they were dragging the poor woman up the hill to Blakemere Pool. Some say that she was to be drowned there, a simple execution. Others say that she was to be ducked, that testing of whether someone is a witch by seeing if they float or sink. The sheer ridiculous wretchedness of having innocence provable only by dying apparently lost on anyone. The distinction doesn't really matter. Blakemere Pool was to be the scene of her demise at the hands of her community, led by an awful man who professed to love her. A tale as old as time. She screamed and she fought, but to no avail. But just before she slipped under the water, she managed to spit out a curse against Joshua Linnet that he would suffer as she had. And as the waters finally closed over her head, the last thing she heard was his raucous, mocking laughter. Down in the darkness, bound as she was, she could do nothing to stop the water pouring into her lungs, an indescribable, choking, burning pain. She thrashed, madly, desperately, fighting for every last ounce of strength she had within her. All of that did no good, but on her lips lingered the words of that curse. Now she was no witch, but she knew of the power of words passed down from her mother who had learned them from her mother before her, and so on and so forth. Back, a long line of women who knew well the evil of men, and what little power they had to resist it. And in her final moment, as this unnamed woman's body spasmed and then went still, the power of those words spread out from her lips, radiating across her face, down and round and over and deep into her body, until she was all consumed with an old wild magic. She twisted and contorted now, but not in pain, by the force of the spell which overtook her, infused with her, and she changed. Joshua Linnet returned back to Blakemere Pool a few days after the incident, presumably to gloat at his power, at his cruelty, perhaps for even darker reasons, to see if a body could be found. But returning was a mistake, the last one that he would ever make. Now her body was never found, but Joshua Linnet's, they found that the next day on the shore by the pool. It was possible he'd been drowned, he was certainly wet enough. But it was very hard to tell, for the most remarkable thing about that corpse was how its face had been torn to pieces. The first victim of the Blakemere Pool mermaid, but certainly not the last. And if you want to cheer that, you absolutely can. It's not a happy tale, but it's a sort of happy ending. And after that, well, the people whispered stories of the pool, warned men off of it, tapped the sign in the pub, read the poem. But despite that, there were always some who never could quite resist the allure of a shapely arm beckoning from the waves. Now that's the end of this story, as it's usually told. But some add that Blakemere, like Doxy, is bottomless. And some folklorists have even gone further, said that this whole thing about two mermaids who both end up in the peaks, living so close to each other, is absolute bunkum. Total balderdash, a fanciful tale this. let's be rational about it. The truth of the matter is that obviously there's just one mermaid. The two pools are joined by some watery tunnel under the hills and valleys, and one singular mermaid travels between them. And that theory is all good. But, well, I have my own spin on this. A slightly different theory, all of my own. Let's return to the poor mermaid of Doxy Pool. One day, like every day, she is spiralling madly in the pitch-dark depths of that pool, whirling around and around in her awful prison. She's alone. Down, down she dives, and then up, up again, up and down, round and round, each day like the one before, each day slipping further into madness, and alone, so very, very alone. And down in the darkness, a hand grabs hold of hers, holds it tight, and the mermaid of Blakemere Pool says very gently, "It's okay. I've got you. I've got you now." And what happens to them next is another story. But there have been few mermaid sightings in either pool of late, and I like to think that that is because the mermaids are very happy, living a life together, well away from the surface and the world of men. And that would be a fine place to end this episode, wouldn't it? But I promised you stories of free mermaids, and I also contrarily started with an epilogue that we have not yet reached. So I've just got for you now one very tiny last tale, so short in fact that you could, appropriately enough, probably safely go swimming after snacking down on it. The third mermaid inhabits yet another pool. Her pool lies on the side of the closest the peaks has to a proper mountain, the Kinder Scout, and the pool is called the Mermaids Pool. Simple, straightforward, does what it says on the tin. She seems to have been of a rather different character than the other two, and sighted even more rarely than them. And unlike them, her origins are shrouded in mystery, endlessly debated but fundamentally unknown. The only thing that was certain was that she would appear but once a year, at dawn on Easter Sunday. Not sure why, maybe it was because they didn't have cream eggs under the water and she had a craving, though oddly enough the thing that she craved most according to the legends was a pocket watch, presumably a highly water-resistant one. And it was said that if you saw her, if she liked you, if perhaps you offered her a pocket watch or maybe a chocolate-covered egg, then she would grant you the gift of immortality. Seemingly a rather unequal exchange, that one, but don't look a gift horse in the mouth and all. How she gained the power to bestow this, I cannot say. But that power she had. And yet despite that, few made the attempt to seek her out. Some scoffed at the legend entirely. Mermaids, what nonsense. Some who did believe worried that exchange rate really did seem too favourable, that there would be some hidden extra, clause. And many others simply feared her for being a mermaid and all that entailed, had read the poem in the pub. And there were also probably some like me that thought getting up at that time in the morning just wasn't worth it, whatever the potential prize. But one man did seek her out, made the journey on Easter Sunday. He came from the nearby village of Hayfield. Let's return to the start of this episode, to the epilogue, the recollections of the man from Hayfield. He remembers how he had made that way to the pool at the brink of dawn on some 18th century Easter Sunday, watch in his pocket. How a shapely arm had extended from the pool, how he reached down, grasped that proffered hand. The fingers of the two of them intertwined, a spark ran between them, and she dragged him into the water with a splash. The mermaid liked the man from Hayfield very much. The story says that they whiled away some very pleasant time in some nearby cave or alcove. And after that was done, she took his watch. And in return, she gave him back all the time in the world, and then some. The story of the man from Hayfield after that? Well, that is a tale too long for any podcast. But let's jump ahead in it a bit. To his ritual of remembrance complete, he stands, it is done, and now he has nothing to stay for. He can leave. And soon, by whatever means, he is on his way, and from whatever impossible to imagine conveyance he uses, he turns, takes one look back at the dying earth, and then he faces into the future. No more will he be confined to just one tiny planet. Not when there was a whole wide universe that he was meant to swim in. And that is the rather ridiculous end of this episode. At least as far as the stories go, because we've got a bit of episode still to go on with. Before I begin, I'm going to give you fair warning. This is my longest ever discussion section, but probably not my most interesting. Basically, I was clearly so racked with guilt that I told the first versions of these stories I came across, rather than researching first, that I decided I'd do a real proper deep dive on this whole topic, and have thus produced a sort of line-by-line chronology of the evidence for mermaid stories at the various pools I've discussed. And I'm just going to reel that off now, which might not be to everyone's taste. There is a summary on my website if that's more palatable. It certainly might be easy to understand. Or, just stop entirely, come back for the next episode where I'll actually have more stories as opposed to amateur research hour. However, if for some strange reason that hasn't put you off, then, well, let's make like a Norse sea creature and crack on. So, to start with, I'll re-emphasise what I said at the start and give some context here. I have been aware of the Peak District mermaids for a very long time, well before I began this podcast, which is basically an eon ago now. When I moved to Sheffield, just on the outskirts of the peaks, if you take even a cursory glance at Peak District folklore, like I of course did, the mermaids are there, nice and central. Naturally, there's a lot of other things, but Google Peak District folklore and they'll be in the shallows right there, because they're cool, right? And it's for that reason that I've actually visited all 3 mermaid pools well before I thought of actually doing an episode on them. All of them I visited in pretty bleak, misty conditions. Not intentionally, by a sort of accident, but to be honest, if you do go to the peaks, there's a good chance that things will be misty and bleak. Now, none of the pools really look like the kind of a romantic place you might imagine a mermaid being. They are, well, dark, cold, foreboding pools in remote locations. I've dropped my own pictures of Doxy on the website so you can take a look. Though to be fair, some people have taken pictures that make them look a bit nicer. And I've included some of those as well. Now, I should say that when I introduced this episode, I did sort of suggest the Peak District is absolutely chock full of mermaids, which is probably a bit of an exaggeration. The Peaks is a big place. Most places in it don't have mermaids. You could spend a lot of time in the Peaks and not come across a mermaid at all, except maybe if you went into Buxton Museum where there's also a mermaid, but I'm not going to talk about that one because I'm going to talk about too many anyway. And not only is the Peak District not full of mermaids, I possibly gave the impression that, well, the Peak District was sort of unique in having inland mermaids. There are certainly other inland mermaid legends in Britain, but this many close together is a fair concentration of them. Anyway, I was familiar with these tales when I came to write these stories, into a live show, which was basically what you just heard, but with some tweaks around audience participation, as you might understand. And so I wrote the stories of the mermaids as I knew them. But sneakily, I did some swapsies. For Doxy Pool is said to have a mermaid in it, but there's not really a story of it. I'll come back to that later. But fortuitously, Blackmere has 2 mutually exclusive stories associated with it. And given that it had too many and Doxy didn't have enough, I moved the sailor, who I call Gordon, from Flash for a very quick joke. I moved his story over to Doxy Pool. And then, of course, because of the legend of the tunnel connecting the two, which very much does exist, I tacked on that ending, which I hope pleases, Chapel Roan fans. But when I came to this podcast episode, peered a little deeper into the origins of these mermaid stories, well, things were a little bit more fishy than I was expecting. So I kept on going, and here's where I'm going to just let you know where I've got to with Peak District mermaid research, quote unquote. Big disclaimer here, I am not an expert. I have Google, the Internet Archive, and a subscription to the British Newspaper Archive. Thank you, patrons, for that one. There are academics and people who invested a lot more time and have a lot more research skills than I do, who have also written on this subject. I'll mention some of them now, and I've linked to their articles. But this is about the 20th disclaimer you have, so let's get going. And let's kick off with the Mermaid's Pool on the Kinderscout. For this, I refer you first to the work of Dr. Simon Young, who's done a lot of work on mermaid place names particularly. He says that the earliest evidence for the Mermaid's Pool is an 1840 map. Not the pool itself, but it being called the Mermaid's Pool. And I can't find any evidence before that either. Now that is pretty late, but there's no good reason to believe it wasn't called that for some time really, though I would hesitate to say when. Now the pool is referred to by a few different names, depending on the author, and sometimes within the same article. It's the Mermaid or Mermaids, Bath, Love and Well. But the through line being that this body of water is clearly very strongly associated with a mermaid by the mid-19th century, and from 1870 onwards, mentions of this mermaid crop up very regularly in newspaper and folklore collections about the area. Now, with some exceptions, her character across these mentions remains pretty consistent, though details do change. An 1872 account in the Derbyshire Times gives a standard one, describing her as a beautiful English hamadryad, a spirit and a nymph, and says that she bathes in the pool once a day, and that any man who sees her will become immortal. And here it also mentions the man from Hayfield, who encounters her one day, whereafter he was, quote, conducted to a cavern, wherein he lingered for some time, unquote. Which has just got to be a euphemism. And before he leaves, he gives her that watch. Now, even though I read that account after writing my story, it has an ending that really resonates with mine, dwelling on his immortality, with the man from Hayfield last seen, quote, wending his way on a journey doomed to never end, unquote, which is a marvellous turn of phrase and makes the whole thing more sinister than I made it out to be. I like it. But just to emphasise a detail you may have missed there, in this version she doesn't appear at Easter, she appears once a day, every day. The author does suggest that, knowing that she bathes there every day but not knowing the time, anyone who wants to become immortal can just sort of camp out there in the hopes of seeing her, but suggests that this sort of cynical behaviour might be liable to put her off, and she might purposefully keep out of sight of anyone she doesn't like, so she doesn't accidentally give them immortality. And also, a convenient explanation if you don't see her at the pool, though a bit of a sad one as well. Nope, you went to the pool, looked for the mermaid, waited all day long, she didn't appear, and that's because she doesn't like your face. Now the accounts are a bit split about how the immortality gets granted, but most do suggest it is just by looking at her, that she doesn't do anything to cause it, and in fact she has to sort of actively hide and not give it to people she doesn't want to, which seems like a fairly big responsibility for her. And none of the stories really go into where she got this power from, which is fine. Now, some of you might be asking, hang on Graham, you said she bathes there. Why does a mermaid need to bathe? Aren't mermaids bathing by default? And that is a very good question, and the term bathe crops up in quite a lot of the 19th century accounts. And in more than a few versions, she's not a mermaid at all. An 1882 version has her as a, quote, beautiful woman who lives in the side of the Scout, unquote. It says that she comes to bathe every day in Mermaid's Well, and that the man who has the good luck to behold her bathing will become immortal and never die. So, she is magical, yes, but a mermaid, no. At least as we would understand mermaid, but as I'll touch on quite a few times in this discussion section, mermaid can often just sort of refer to a woman in the water. And the term is often used interchangeably, as it seems to be here, with a naiad, a female spirit connected to water from classical mythology that these classically versed writers of the 19th century would have been very familiar with. Just because it's called the Mermaid's Pool doesn't necessarily mean it has to have an actual mermaid in it. It's got a woman who's swimming, or some other enchanted mythological figure like a mermaid, but not the half fish, half woman that we all instinctively think of today. So moving on from that difference, the daily version is the one that is most often told, but others, an 1880 version for instance, says it's once a year on Easter Sunday. And in that version, it's at midnight on Easter Sunday, not at dawn as I had it, which is a fairly common variant as well. In fact, in all the versions I can find of it from the 19th century, it's either every day or at midnight on the morning of Easter Sunday, though at least one source puts it at about 3 in the morning on Easter Sunday. And versions that refer to dawn on Easter Sunday only start appearing in the 20th century. And then midnight and dawn at Easter sort of compete, and the daily one really disappears. Some versions that mention Easter also mention a famous Hayfield resident, Aaron Ashton, who apparently went to the pool every Easter and then lived to 104 years old, which, while not exactly immortal, is hardly bad going. Though I did go and check out his actual obituary, and it doesn't mention anything about the mermaid, but I like this little tying of him, clearly a very notable figure even 100 years after his death, to this story. Now, I think it's worth mentioning at this point 2 things. 1, that there is another mermaid legend at Rosfernmere in Cheshire, hardly a million miles away, about a mermaid who rings a bell underwater on Easter Sunday. So, some Easter connection there. There are also just quite a lot of folk stories where something happens on Easter Sunday, as there are at the other pivotal points of the year. Though, I will remind you, the earliest version does have her appearing every day, so it might be later on, late 19th century, where this sort of gets mixed together with Easter traditions, Easter folk stories, though I am really just supposing there. And I think perhaps most pertinently of these traditions is a once reasonably widespread folk tradition in Britain and Ireland of the dancing sun on Easter Sunday, connected with the new light on that day, said to represent Jesus himself, the new light, the world, the resurrection. The sun was said to literally dance in the sky in joy at Jesus being saved. It seems that people would climb hills before dawn on Easter Sunday in the hope of seeing this sun dancing in the sky. And while it's very widespread, it's notable that Castleton, not too far at all from the Mermaid's Pool, is one such area that people are noted to have done this. It was clearly present in the Peak District. And the Mermaid's Pool is certainly on a very big hill. It's even more worth noting because I think a lot of the accounts I've read of this, as well as talking about the sun dancing around in the sky literally, refer to seeing it in a bit more of a subtle way. People might not climb the hill, but instead they would see the sun dance on the surface of the water, mentioning brooks and lakes, and in at least one instance, just seeing the sun dance in a glass of water. So we have an Eastery, watery connection, and of course Easter and immortality do have a bit of a connection there as well. So, as with pretty much everything I'm saying here, I can't be really sure about this, sort of stumbling around in the dark, but it seems possible that this tradition and that of the mermaid have at some point been connected, or were always connected. Now, some later sources, 20th, 21st century sources, do add to the whole mermaid tale that if she sees you at Easter, or you see her, and she doesn't like you, then she will potentially kill you, give you the opposite of immortality. But I do feel here that there's most likely a confusion or a deliberate blending of her tale with that of the mermaid of Blackmere Pool, which we'll turn to in just a moment. Or, with murderous mermaids in general, which is a very, very old trope indeed. The only time this sort of crops up before the 20th century that I've found is a fictional poem from 1869 that does talk about a mermaid in that pool drowning people. Curiously, this is the only source I have found mentioning that she appears on Midsummer's Day, and it doesn't sound like any of the other tales about it. It mentions none of the immortality bit, and honestly, it just seems like a standard literary take on the mermaid, copy and pasted onto the mermaid in Mermaid's Pool with no local flavour at all. She is a fairly standard, seductive, drown-you type mermaid. And don't get me wrong, I don't mean to be dismissive of that. It's a pretty decent take on that. Gotta like the ending. Quote, She sang, and stretching out her rounded arms, she bade him leap and take her for his own. With one wild cry he leapt, and with a splash that roused the timid moorhen from her nest, sank 'neath the darkling wave for evermore. Unquote. I like it, but I'm sceptical about how much connection it has to the actual mermaid in the pool in anything approaching local folklore, rather than just being generic Murderous Mermaid 101. Speaking of fictional 19th century accounts of this mermaid, I should now turn to the novel The History of David Grieve from the early 1890s, which makes mention of this mermaid's pool specifically, and as well as referring to the folklore I've just discussed that was known of it, it also says that the place was known as Jenny Crumb's Pool, after Jenny Crumb, who was a witch, who was drowned here. Now, this could possibly have been a real local legend, but everywhere else I have found this, it has the novel clearly as the source ultimately, so I can be reasonably certain it was invented for that novel. But, let's put a pin in that whole witch thing. Though actually putting pins in witches is probably quite a sensitive topic. Let's remember that, and I'll come back to it when we turn to Blackmere. But before leaving the unnamed immortality-granting mermaid behind us, I just want to say I really like her mysterious, vaguely numinous, mystical qualities. While there's an element of earthy or watery lust in her stories, there's something more spiritual, metaphysical, tantalising about her, with that strange gift of immortality. Hardly an unknown trope in folk tales, but certainly not common, and when it does come, often clearly carrying the downside. Whereas here, it's just left a bit more open. There's an ambiguity to it, if it's good or bad. Now, while I'm normally a sucker for creatures that do humans dirty, humans oft deserving of that, there is something wistfully evocative about the idea of visiting a remote pool of sparkling water as the day comes in, and all the enchanted promise such an encounter holds. And I should add to this that, while I was very mean about what the pool looked like, hers is probably the nicest of the three. One of the accounts I found of it describes it in a completely different manner, the author breathlessly saying it was beautiful, shining out, admittedly amongst so much that was dark. But however much I like her, I'm still not getting up that early in the morning to catch her. Certainly not for the probably cursed gift of immortality. Though I suppose if I did have that, I might finally finish the podcast in a few hundred millennia or so at my current rate. Let's turn now to Blackmere Pool, or Blakemere Pool, or, simply Blackmere or Blakemere, because mere means lake or pond after all. And that mere is, of course, related to mere as in mermaid. The word in different contexts can refer to lake or pool or sea. So Blackmere, as I'm now going to call it, very appropriate place for a mermaid. And one author I really like, who writes lots and lots about fairies, John Cruise, has used the term mermaids to describe inland mermaids of the type I'm discussing today, which I really like. Continuing to discuss its name for a minute, one thing I didn't mention in the story is that Blackmere is often referred to straight up just as Mermaid's Pool, at least since, you guessed it, the mid-19th century. So a mermaid has been associated with it at least since then. But Blackmere has a reputation that is older than that. A reputation that it is not a very nice place, a place where something is a bit off. According to some sources, this little pool was written about back all the way in the 12th century, far older than anything else I'm talking about today, by about half a millennia. It is true that the medieval scholar Andrew Neckham wrote about a lake in Staffordshire that, to quote a translation, quote, "A lake that with prophetic noise does roar, where beasts can ne'er be forced to venture over. By hounds or men or fleeter death pursued, they'll not plunge in, but shun the hated flood." Unquote. It was a scary lake that animals would not go near because they found it so scary. Now, it's stated in quite a few later sources that the lake our 12th century chronicler is talking about is Blackmere. And I'm not quite sure why. A lot of them refer to a 17th century author, William Camden, regarding this. But I went and looked at what he said, and he said that, yes, there was this poem about the lake in Staffordshire, But he's also very clear when he says that we can't tell what lake this is. And Staffordshire is a big place, and this isn't even a very big lake in it. So I'm a bit confused about why people think that the two are related, which doesn't entirely mean that they aren't, but it is a bit odd. I think possibly the reason might be because we do have evidence that another 17th century author, going by the name of Dr. Plot, great supervillain name that, in a book from 1686, he doesn't actively refer to the poem, but he does say that the pool has a sinister reputation, and that cattle are supposed to refuse to drink from it, and no birds will fly over it or settle on it. Which, while it's not precisely the same as the lake in the poem, it sounds pretty similar, I admit. So I'm going to leave that poem behind now, just with it might go back to the 12th century in it. The first definitive thing I can say is that by the time, 1686, that Dr. Plot was writing, it did have such a reputation. Plot also says that it is reputed to be bottomless, which adds to its reputation. Now, Plot does not make mention of a mermaid at all, but he does include a story that he says is true and could almost fit on a Tales of Britain and Ireland episode itself. It starts with a man drinking in a pub in nearby-ish Leek. And by nearby-ish, I mean it's like 3 or 4 miles from Blackmere Pool to the very outskirts of Leek, probably 7 to the centre. But this man is drinking in Leek, and it's a horrible night. And his companions, who Plot calls, quote, persons of inferior rank, unquote, and I'm honestly not sure if he's trying to be actively bitchy or if he just sees this as a neutral term to describe them. Clearly they just are people of inferior rank, that's the truth of it. But regardless, our big drinker is boasting of how even though it's such a stormy, awful night, he is willing to go to the Black Mere of Morridge, 'cause he's so brave. Normal bloke in the pub stuff. And his mates, they take him up on this. They say, right, if you go, we'll give you a whole crown. But we know you won't. However, he calls their bluff, takes them up on it. The problem of evidence rears its head, and he says he'll leave a certain stick at the pool so they'll all know he's been there. And I sort of assume they have to check on it in the morning. Unclear. Anyway, the issue of evidence is solved, and off he goes into the wild night. I don't know whether he was drunkenly riding a poor horse through the terrible weather, or just walking it. One thing I encounter quite often when researching podcast tales is just how far people walked on the regular back in old days, on top of just daily life. It's sort of phenomenal, actually. So he might have just been doing that, he might have been on horseback. However, off he goes, walks or maybe rides the miles up the hill in the darkness and the dismal storm until he's bearing down on the pool. No headphones back then, so he is just raw-dogging this journey, as I understand they say these days, slightly unfortunately. But when he approaches the mere on this wicked night, to his alarm, he hears the distressed cry of a young woman begging for mercy. And rather than considering mermaids, he jumps swiftly to the correct conclusion, that some woman had been brought to the pool for murdering. And yes, indeed, she is about to be drowned by her lover, a lover who had gotten her pregnant and now wishes to do away with her because of that, a sadly common occurrence back in the day. Probably in reality, certainly if you believe folk stories. See also the episode on boggarts. Now, our unnamed hero from Leek was not just brave but quick thinking. For realising he was alone, but that something needed to be done, he cleverly cried out, and I can see Dr. Plot here thinking, what names do people of inferior rank have? He cried out, Tom, Dick, Jack, here's that rogue we've been looking for. Let's get him. And this worked well. The surprised murderer, thinking a whole bunch were descending on him, fled into the night. Our stout-hearted hero helped up the woman, gave her his coat, and escorted her back to Leek, where she served as far better proof he'd been at the mere than whatever the deal with the stick was. Brave unnamed guy, what a local Leek legend. I assume he got his crown and more besides. It's a good tale and helps cement the pool with an eerie reputation. The kind of place people would be drowned. Though Dr. Plot himself is keen to undercut all these notions of animals not being able to land on it or it being bottomless. For he says rather curtly in brackets, all of which I find false, having presumably done a bit of investigation himself. Now, as well as Dr. Plot's famous story, a couple of years earlier, 1769, a pamphlet mentions that Blackmere was the scene of an actual murder, a far less romantic account. It says that the murderer, Andrew Simpson, also from Leek, had killed before in order to steal, and on this occasion he followed a woman up onto the moors, a woman who was selling cloth and lace and who he had seen with some considerable amount of money. Biding his time until she was close to the mere, where there he struck, strangled her, stole her money and belongings, tied her body to a stone and threw her into the depth of Blackmere. And he would have gotten away with it too, except that when he went to sell her goods, an observant, quick-witted maid became suspicious of the source of his stash of lace and cloth. She discovered it hidden in a haystack, and he was soon caught, and the wares identified as belonging to the missing woman. And for that crime he was executed. Dr. Plot's story of murder is far the happier one, but this one seems more likely to be true. I say more likely because I'm overly cautious, and yes, people were definitely murdered in the past for money, but it also has a narrative that seems quite similar to other stories of murderers that leaves me slightly suspicious. I'd go 50-50 on this one. Now, all this means, in terms of folklore, is that by 1686 the place certainly had a fearsome reputation, but probably had no mermaid. I say that because I think that if there was a mermaid, you'd think either Plot or Thomas Horsley, who wrote about the actual murder, would have mentioned it. Horsley also describes the pool slightly eerily, calls it a strange, deep, black water pond, differing from most ordinary waters. But mermaid references there are none. And the first mention of the mermaid I can find definitively is from the early 1860s. And the nearby Mermaid Inn appears to have been named such between 1850 and 1860. So we can conclude that likely at some point in the 180 years between 1686 and that pub name existing, a story of a mermaid did start to be associated with that pool. Now, I could be wrong, it could have existed in the 17th century, but if we assume for the moment that it didn't, I think there's a few ways this story could have developed. One way that seems likely to me is that there may have been a connection between the association of the pool with women being murdered or escaping from murder and mermaids. As I said before, mermaid was used regularly just for women swimming, and even without that usage, it's a sort of obvious metaphor, isn't it? A woman in a pond sort of just is a mermaid, could be referred to as a mermaid. And this connection is borne out by a couple of other places in England that have that connection, murdered or drowned woman in pits or ponds being referred to as mermaids. Now, we don't have a story that makes this link obvious, and there's a small issue of over a century and a half passing between the murders, or not quite murders, and our first evidence of the mermaid name, so it's just a hunch really, but I do find myself sort of drawn to it. Another possibility is that the mermaid stories were created because of the Mermaid Inn, rather than the inn being named for the stories, which is the common supposition. Or at least the name and the stories sort of sprang to life simultaneously. Imagine when the pub was named, someone started a story about the local pool, which was a notable landmark and already had a sinister reputation, what with the murders and all. And from there, the story started to grow up around it, and no one could tell which came first. Surely it was a good way to drum up interest and knowledge of the pub in this era when tourism was really starting to take off. However, somewhat weighing against both the explanations I've just suggested is the fact that the first recorded mermaid story about Blackmere is nothing at all as dark and sinister as these origins would suggest. Neither is it anything like any of the stories I told on the podcast, or really reminiscent of a drowned woman at all. In that story, which I first found in 1863 and which has been expanded upon in later accounts, the local people determined to get all the water out of Blackmere. Why is not quite clear. One version says it's to see if there really is a mermaid in the pool, but most don't mention that. Whatever their reasons, loads of people are gathered around, merrily draining the pool, or attempting to. Sometimes there's a bit of a party atmosphere to the whole event. Everyone's come out. Basically, what they're doing is they're digging a ditch from the pool to the edge of the hill, with the aim of having all the water flowing out of the pool down the hill, and then it's drained for whatever reason. Just before they reach the edge of the hill, though, the mermaid suddenly appears on the water and tells them that if they do that, all of Leek will drown under these waters. This isn't a threat so much as it's implied that this is because it's bottomless and somehow connected to the sea. When they cut it out into the hill, the sea will keep flowing down the hillside and drown the towns all around. Now the people, they've just seen a mermaid, they sensibly heed the mermaid's warning, as you might, and decide not to risk it. Now, despite the mermaid being the thing that would really stop me doing the digging, sometimes she's not mentioned at all in this story, and somebody just sort of realises, hang on a second, isn't this pool, quote, fed by a blub hole from the sea, unquote? And then goes on to explain how this will lead to all the flooding, and the people decide to stop anyway. Now, across England and Wales, certainly, and, well, wider, there are stories about potential flooding and even mermaids warning of potential flooding, including one variant that's very close, Aqualate Mere, also in Staffordshire. So, I think we've got some variety of migratory tale here, even if not a very common one. A migratory legend, of course, being one where a story is passed around from place to place and localised, changed wittingly or unwittingly to make it look like it was set in the area. And general stories about people making mistakes with engineering or hubris leading to flooding, well, those are very, very old stories, very widespread indeed. And I think here we have an incarnation of that kind of story. I feel at this point I should take stock because we've covered a fair bit of ground. To summarise so far, Blackmere has had a sinister reputation from at least the late 17th century. There's a mermaid in the mere by the 1860s and a nearby pub called the Mermaid Inn. Oddly enough, the mermaid at that point, according to the tales we have, doesn't seem that sinister, despite the pool's sinister reputation. Now, by the 1890s, you've got her starting to be a bit more frightening. That's when the quote I used in the story, her strange form has been seen gliding over the surface of the water, comes from. And in the 20th century, we get that poem I mentioned cropping up about her just drowning men, beckoning them in with her shapely arm. By this point, she is your proper, sinister, seductive mermaid type. A whole poem is written to that effect in the 1930s, and there are references that it appears earlier in the Mermaid Inn, but I'm really not sure when it got into the Mermaid Inn, if it actually ever did at all. But now she's taken on this sinister form, you will still notice, if you're paying attention, that she's still not either of the tales I actually told on the podcast. The ones most associated with Blackmere if you Google it today. That is that the mermaid is a woman falsely accused of witchcraft by Joshua Lynch and drowned in the pool, and that a sailor brought a mermaid from a sea, left her there and died. By the way, that second story about the sailor, that is basically all the detail that we have. A single line, sometimes it says he's from Thorncliffe, which I changed. And so taking that to turning it into a whole story really is probably my most expansive story making yet. But that's an aside. By the 1930s, neither of these stories appear to be connected with Blackmere. Now, in 1955, an article appears in the Staffordshire Sentinel, and that gives the story of the woman drowned as a witch, pretty much fully formed, even naming Joshua Linnet as her unjust accuser after being spurned in love. As far as I can tell, it is the very first account of the accused witch turned mermaid story, with the only difference from later versions being that rather than transforming into a mermaid, it says that she becomes a kind of ghost and drags him down, though it is implied that her ghostly form is that of a mermaid. It's not stated. This article kind of blends that story with the drowned men motif, which they sort of dovetail together, to be honest. And this is the story that has really stuck around and is by far the most common one told of Blackmere today. But where did it come from? Well, normally I'd be tempted to say that the first instance we see it was exactly where it was made up, the Staffordshire Sentinel, 1955. But the rest of that newspaper article is just entirely references to sources I've already mentioned. So it would seem odd for a totally new story to be just snuck in there amongst them, especially with the very particular name of Joshua Linnet we get. It doesn't seem like that was what the author was really doing when they wrote that article. So I think it's quite unlikely to come from there directly, and there must be some intermediary source I cannot find, which has never been digitised, or maybe wasn't written down at all. That source likely sits somewhere after the 1930s accounts of Blackmere, but before 1955. Now, this source could have genuinely been recording a local tradition that had developed, had maybe existed for a long time, maybe a story that has come from the pub. I can't pinpoint it any further. I sort of hope that someone somewhere is listening to this and trying to correct me can find that original source, show me what it was. But I've reached my end on it. All I can say that by 1955, there's a mermaid witch story. And a fairly unique one, by the way. This is not a migratory legend. This does not crop up very often. I think one of the reasons this story is so popular today is precisely that. And this is the point I want to circle back to the other Mermaid's Pool. I mentioned that in the 1891 novel, The History of David Grieve, there is a passage which describes a suspected witch, Jenny Crumb, being drowned in that other mermaid's pool. It's short but visceral. Quote, "Dragged to her death. The hooting crowd, the inexorable parson, the struggle in the water, the last gurgling cry." Unquote. Now, there are quite a lot of differences with this account. This is an old witch. There's no false accusations because of love, no Joshua Linnet. She doesn't become a mermaid. It's a different pool. And yet, despite this, I cannot help but wonder if it's possible that what has happened here is that sometime between that novel coming out in 1891 and our article in 1955, that the story of Jenny Crumb has been changed and crossed intentionally or confused with the other mermaid's pool in the area, that some significant adornments have been made to it to produce the Blackmere witch story that we have today. It's just a hunch, got no real evidence for it, but I sort of suspect it can't be a coincidence either, so if it's not that, there's probably some earlier witch in a mermaid's pool story that both of them are taken from. Now, you might think this whole bit has been a tangent, but I'm going to go off on an even further tangent very briefly here. Because when I quote-unquote researched this, I did a little looking into the author of that book, The History of David Grieve. I just wanted to see if she'd written anything else about the subject, which she hadn't. But she is one of those absolutely fascinating people from history you have never heard of. Mary Augusta Ward. Born in Australia, moved to the UK at 5 because her dad converted to Catholicism, learned French, German, Latin, Spanish and Greek in Oxford, was a forming member of a group pressing for women to be admitted to Oxford University. Yay! Became a best-selling novelist you've also never heard of. By you, I mean me here, of course. Her books becoming so popular in the United States, of all places, that she had the #1 bestsellers in both 1903 and 1905, and was pretty popular in the UK as well. She did lots of charity work, and oh yes, she was the founding president of the Women's Anti-Suffrage League. That is, she was a leader of the campaign against women voting. Mary Augusta Ward. Hell of a biography. I only throw this in because, well, I spent a couple of hours reading about her when I should have been finishing this podcast and thought, why not share it with you? I love history. On top of all of that she did, she wrote a fictional tale about the mermaid's pool on Kinderscout that may or may not have entered local folklore in a transformed manner about a different mermaid's pool in the locality. So, to veer back to the topic, what about the other one-liner story I told you? The sailor who falls in love with a mermaid and brings her back. The one that I blew up like a balloon, puffing all my hot air into those few tantalising words. Well, I've done a bit of a search, and there is no book or magazine or newspaper article from the 20th century that I can see that mentions that story. The earliest reference I can find to it is from Graham Phillips, an author of various esoteric and folkloric books, on his website in 2008. Now, he does at least seem to have visited the Mermaid Inn when it was still open, so it's possible he got the story from there or from someone in the area. But regardless, this seems to be a pretty modern take on this folk story. A take that might have developed at the point where I was all grown up. And my version of it is not even very faithful to that, as I've changed the names for a very cheap joke. So, there you go. Okay, so let's give a quick summation of Blackmere. It has a reputation that possibly goes back to the 12th century as somewhere that animals really don't want to be. It definitely has a reputation of animals not drinking from it by the 17th century, and also the idea that it's bottomless. There are stories of murder and attempted murder there at this time, and by the mid-19th century it's connected with a mermaid related to the Mermaid Inn. Not clear what came first. That mermaid in her earliest incarnation is more worried about stopping people accidentally emptying the pool all over local towns than being murderous and creepy, but not long after that she is definitely a seductive drown you type, which exists alongside her prophetic seal drown you incarnation. This is all well established by 1932 when there's a poem to the effect of avoid the mermaid and her lovely looking arm. At some point by 1955, the story has been put around that she is a woman accused of witchcraft by a spurned local lover who is drowned but then gets her revenge when she turns into a mermaid, and after that she becomes the seductive murderer of men previously established. At some point in all of this, the idea that her pool is linked to Doxy Pool by a tunnel comes about. I'll discuss more about that in a moment. And later, possibly as late as the late 20noughties, is that what we call them? I was there and I'm still not sure. Anyway, we get a single line then about her being brought there by a sailor from Thorncliffe who fell in love with her. Oh, and if you're thinking, but Graham, is the pool actually bottomless? Well, I was amused at a 1957 report from the Birmingham Daily Post that is entitled, quote, "End of a Legend," which says no one had ever bothered to check if it was bottomless, which is not actually true, but I'll gloss over that. And then it reports, slightly gleefully to my mind, that, quote, "Mr Davis, committee member of the North Staffordshire branch of the British Sub-Ackle Club, put on his frogman's equipment yesterday and went to sea. He reported, at its deepest point it is no more than 6 feet deep, and there is a lot of mud at the bottom," unquote. So, end of a legend. Boo, Birmingham Daily Post and Mr Davis. So 2 down now, and on to Doxy, where I moved that Sailor Mermaid story to. But given that that has no real connection to it, what's the real deal with Doxy Pool and mermaids? Well, the thing with Doxy Pool is that while it's certainly mentioned as a sort of spooky place, often in the same breath as Blackmere Pool, given they're quite close together, an 1894 account, for instance, describes it as having dark waters and says it is a gloomy but romantic tarn. And the roaches, the rocky ridge atop which it sits, are often described in rightfully dramatic language. From the same source we have, quote, "What a picture of rock scenery is now presented to us. Huge gritstone boulders lie scattered round in wild confusion, no two alike in size, shape or position, while above a bare escarpment of rock, wild, jagged and precipitous, extends along the face of the ridge as far as we can see. Small wonder that the simple minds of the country folk of other days should have regarded this wild place with awe and invested it with many a weird legend." Unquote. Despite all of this reputation, the earliest account of any mermaid I can find at Doxy Pool is from 1974. And it's a very unusual one, at least by my standards. And I probably mean by that rather than being folkloric, it's kind of cryptozoological or paranormal. It's a first-hand account that is said to have taken place in 1949. It's from a work by Florence E. Petit in a book called Shrines of Psychic Power, A Spiritual Pilgrimage, which I of course read a bit of because I hadn't spent enough time on this already. Florence was clearly a deeply spiritual and religious woman, and the book details her experiences in a variety of numerous places across the UK, many of which will be familiar to you and certainly to me. She goes to Iona, Glastonbury, Chanctonbury Ring, the Devil's Dyke. It's an enviable folkloric historical travel list, only improved by the inclusion of Doxy Pool, which is not actually named as such in the text, but is the only place she can really be talking about. If you're interested in that book, I have, of course, linked to it on the website, along with the other sources I referred to. And I think, for this one, I may as well just quote what she says in full. Quote, "When alone, I stripped off and was just about to enter the water when a great thing rose up in the middle of the lake. It rose very quickly until it was 25 to 30 feet tall, seeming to be part of the slimy weeds in the water. Yet it had eyes, and those eyes were extremely malevolent. It pointed its long, bony fingers menacingly at me, so that there was no mistaking its hostility. I stood staring at the undine water spirit naiad, or whatever it was, while my heart raced. Its feet just touched the surface of the water, yet it was at one and the same time part of the water, the weeds, and the air. I stepped backwards onto the bank and dressed shakily. When I dared to look again, the creature was dissolving back into the elements from which it had been formed." Unquote. Weird and a bit spooky, right? Also, the absolute presence of mind to sort of put your clothes back on rather than just fleeing in terror. Impressive. Now, that encounter seems to be the source of every mermaid story about Doxy Pool, that pretty much all of them either quote that passage or tell it in full. It's a bit of an internet favourite, and you can see why, and I've of course added to that in a small way. Now, some of these more modern references do also call the creature in the pool Jenny Greenteeth, which is a very generic name for a water-dwelling evil creature across the north of England. I can only imagine that got attached to this tale to distinguish this Doxy Pool creature from your more friendly mermaids, given Jenny is a bit of a go-to for terrifying water spirit, which, while she's not exactly what Florence Petite reported, she maps closely enough and certainly more than your standard mermaid do. Appearance-wise, it's a good pool to be haunted by such a creature. It's definitely made people like me want to visit it more, though I'm not quite sure who's benefiting from that, apart from the local ice cream van. And yes, I did eat an ice cream in the rain and the mist. I live in England. If I didn't eat ice cream in the wind and the rain and the cold, I would never eat ice cream at all, and that is simply unacceptable. And that's basically it all to say about Doxy Pool, at least when it comes to mermaids. Having now looked at all three pools, I should say there are a few legends vaguely associated with them I haven't touched upon, non-mermaid ones, like a witch's familiar in the Kinderscout mermaid pool, a headless horseman who rides along the Morridge, and Doxy Pool is connected to either a loose woman or a highwayman's daughter, both of whom I assume are full of moxie. These are cool, interesting, weird places, and legends attract to them, and the mermaids are just some of the most popular and the latest ones. That's how folk stories work. Now, I have been talking for a very long time already. This is my longest discussion section by far, but I don't think I can rightly sign off without touching on a discussion of mermaids, and specifically British mermaids, by Dr. Simon Young, friend of the podcast, who has studied this in great detail with reference to inland mermaids specifically. He gives a brief history of mermaids in Britain and makes a point that I think is quite important, that the use of the term in English for many centuries doesn't really refer to creatures that look like the mermaids we think of today, at least exclusively look like the creatures we know as mermaids today. Young uses the example of Grendel's mother in Beowulf, described as a merwife, the equivalent term for mermaid at the time, even though she's a pretty nasty creature. He also refers to a process whereby sea or lake enchantress-type figures become known as mermaids and in time adopt the characteristics of your regular mermaid. And while he's not talking about England in particular, I am very much reminded of the woman naiad in the Mermaid's Pool as a possible example of this. The overall point is that what a mermaid is rather appropriately somewhat fluid, changes over time. Dr. Young argues that by the 19th century, the standard half-woman, half-fish mermaid, alluring, sometimes deadly, but often having a family as well, children are often referred to as mermaids. This kind of mermaid had become so ubiquitous in people's imagination that it had in essence pushed out conceptions of other types of mermaid. So anything that was called a mermaid then becomes one of these modern mermaids by default. He points out how this is similar to what's happened with fairies, and I think, to be honest, it's also similar to what's happened with ghosts. It's a common phenomenon about supernatural creatures. And he posits specifically that older inland mermaids are probably much more close to other dangerous, supernatural, solitary beings, of which there are rather a lot in British folklore, than they are to our standard conception of a mermaid. And I throw that in because while the evidence I have collected doesn't have any of these being older than the 19th century, that is always a bit of a dodgy conclusion because, the 19th century is when stuff started to be written down in large volumes, and is also the time when you've got the stuff that was written down available on the internet easily now. There's a little diagram of a plane with holes in its wings that comes to mind. So despite my evidence coming from the 19th century, it's certainly possible they have earlier origins. For we definitely have a range of creatures here. The ghost of a falsely accused witch, an immortality-granting, seemingly benevolent enchantress who might actually just be a person living in a hill, and a weird-ass, malevolent, 30-foot-tall thing are actually pretty good examples of just how mutable the mermaid category can be. And that's a fine note to end on, but I've got one more thing to say before the end, because I just got sort of excited. I said at the start that there were possibly 5 mermaids in the peaks, and I've told you about 3 pools, 4 mermaids amongst them if you take the witch and the sailor one to be different, and if you take the thing at Doxy to be a mermaid. But when researching, I found one tantalising reference to possibly another mermaid legend. It's in a work called The Legendary Lore of the Holy Wells of England from 1893 by Robert Charles Hope. And it specifically lists the mermaid pool at Kinderscout and alongside it, another mermaid pool at Mill Hill, Chapel on the Frith. The section about the Chapel on the Frith one is so short I can just quote it here. Quote, "On Easter Eve at 12 o'clock when Easter Day is coming in, if you look steadfastly into the pool, you will see a mermaid." Unquote. Now, given that we have the Easter reference, and the proximity of Mill Hill to Kinderscout, at least if we're talking about the same Mill Hill, is very, very close indeed. If I had read this anywhere else on its own, I would definitely conclude it was referring to the Kinderscout Mermaid Pool. But in this work, it is specifically noted as 2 different pools. Now, this is the only reference I have been able to find to this. Chances are that they are referring to the same pools, that Robert Hope just got confused. But just maybe, there might have been a 4th pool and a 5th mermaid, and on Easter you could take your pick of which one you wanted to see. Possibly even go have a look at one without risking that pesky chance of immortality, or her just not liking you and trying to hide, and all the embarrassment that would bring. A tantalising possibility. If anybody knows anything more about a possible 4th mermaid pool, then please do let me know. And now we're at the end. Unbelievably, I actually have lots more I could say, but I'm going to leave it there. I've summarised this discussion on my website. It might be clearer to follow there if you're still interested. And if you are listening still, it just remains for me to say an absolutely massive thank you for, being here. I hope you've done it because you really enjoy this. Let me know, as per always. I am going to try and make this podcast a bit more regular again. That's the plan for next year. And a massive thank you, of course, to my patrons. I've actually had people join, so a massive thanks to them, to PB, to Megan Kylar, to Timur Khan, to Eleanor, to Lisa Cook, to Anthony, to Daisy Evans, and to David M. Castle. That is quite a lot of names. Thank you so much for supporting me. Okay, that truly is it. I am going to try and write a story very quickly for the next episode and get it out fast. So, probably 5 months or so. Let's see how it can go. And I think I'm probably going to go off to Scotland, but if I don't, don't be entirely surprised. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I'll see you again soon-ish. You can follow Tales of Britain and Ireland podcast on Blue Sky, Instagram, Threads and Facebook. There's also a website, talesofbritainandireland.com, where there's a page for each episode which contains more information, including illustrations, asides and recaps, along with other additional bits and pieces to explore. The intro music was written and performed by Alice Nichols, and the outro music by Mitch Keeley and Josh Newman. And you can find all the other musical credits on the episode page on the website. If you enjoyed this podcast, then please do share it with others or give it a review, as those really are the best ways to help us out. You can also join Tales of Britain and Ireland on Patreon to get extra members episodes. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you'll join me again soon.